It's good to look out and to see that the numbers in our audience are increasing. That is a blessing, even with some of the people that we normally see. I've noticed may not be here this morning. We have some that have returned who have been away from us for a very long time. And we have some visitors with us, and we're appreciative of that as well. And so it's good to look out, and it's good to see that things are beginning to improve. And we need to, as was mentioned, continue to pray for that improvement and continue to pray for all of those that are taking advantage of the opportunity to try to receive the vaccines from the COVID virus, and also to kind of remind ourselves and continue to look to God and recognize that we need to make sure that as we move forward, we need to move forward looking to Him, asking for His guidance, and asking Him to help us to remember what it is that's truly important and what we need to do. In our bulletin last week, we had an article, a very well-written article, that mentioned Elijah. And I kind of wanted to follow up a little bit with the idea of Elijah and who he was and what kind of man that he was. And I got to thinking, and if I were to ask you, what's the first thing you think of when you think of Elijah, would you have said, as was written in James, the 5th chapter and verse 17, that Elijah is a man with a nature like ours? Is that the first thing that comes to mind? Or do you think of how when he prayed for fire that God granted his wish for fire? Do you think about how when he was struggling and needed to be fed that he was fed with or by the ravens? The ravens came to him and fed him. What are those things that you think about? And I have to be honest, that statement in James chapter 5, verse 17 did not come to my mind when I started thinking about this lesson and when I started considering studying Elijah. And then I realized just how important it is to study this particular individual and to understand who he was and what he went through. And that's because he's just like you and me, right? He has a nature just like you and I do. And so we can learn from the struggles and the accomplishments that he went through in his life. And certainly as I think about what we're going to look at in 1 Kings chapter 19, and as I think about how he retreated into himself and the problems that that caused, it seemed appropriate to discuss this at this time in our situation in the world. Once again, with the idea that with so much going on in the world and for some not being able to leave their homes, we can find ourselves retreating into ourselves at home. We can find ourselves cutting ourselves off from people. And we need to recognize what happens when that takes place. We need to recognize what happened when Elijah cut himself off from other people. And for this particular lesson, it's a little rough because it doesn't leave you with the feel-good that will come out of the account of Elijah as you continue on and continue his study. We don't have the time, but we may in a future lesson come back and address within chapter 19 how God dealt with and how he treated and helped Elijah. But the focus for this morning, I want to be a warning to us. I really do. I want us to recognize this is a man with a nature like ours, but this is a man of God, one who did many great things. He was one of God's great prophets. And yet, even he struggled at times during his life. Just like you and I. I want to open just by looking at 1 Kings chapter 19 and looking at the first 4 verses. The Word of God says, and Ahab told Jezebel all that Elijah had done, also how he had executed all the prophets with the sword. Verse 2, then Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah, saying, so let the gods do to me, and more also, if I do not make your life as the life of them by tomorrow about this time. And of course, what does she mean by that? Make your life as the life of them. Means just like you had them killed, that's what, woe is me if it doesn't happen to you, if I don't make that happen to you. Verse 3, and when he saw that, he arose and he ran for his life, and went to Beersheba, which belongs to Judah, and he left his servant there. Verse 4, but he himself went a day's journey into the wilderness, and came and sat down under a broom tree. And he prayed that he might die, and said, it is enough now, Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my fathers. And so what I want us to consider is the question, what has happened to this great man of God who saw God miraculously stop the rain and start it again at his request, as we see in 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 and 7. He saw God feed him with ravens. I don't know if any one of you have ever had a bird fly to you and give you food. If you have, I'd love to hear it, because that sounds pretty amazing, doesn't it? Can you imagine if somebody came to you? You won't believe what just happened the other day. I was outside and a bird, whatever bird you want him, came to me with food. It's pretty amazing. That shows the miraculous power of God in this man's life. He saw God multiply meal and oil for him and a widow's family. All of this, again, is coming out of 1 Kings 17, leading up to where we are now. In verses 8 through 16, we see him and dealing with the widow. He sees in chapter 17, verses 17 through 24, how God uses him to raise the widow's son from the dead. That's miraculous. That's the God that has been with him, right? That's the God that he has been taken care of by. And to send fire when he prayed for it in 1 Kings, the 18th chapter, in verses 20 through 40. And when you go back and you read that account, that is him challenging the gods of Baal. Remember that? And how he said, let's have a test. You can't serve God and Baal. And so he created that test. And they were to pray for fire. How well did it go for the servants of Baal? Did they get what they were praying for? And then what does Elijah do? He takes it even a little bit further, doesn't he? Remember, he surrounds it with water. Surrounds it with water. And then he prays to God for fire. And what happens? His God brings fire. You think that had an impact on those that were worshiping Baal? Think that had an impact when they saw what the power of God could do? This is what has happened in the very near time that we're dealing with. You see, it really can't be more than about a 24-hour period. From the time that he wins this particular challenge and the time that Ahab goes back and tells Jezebel what's taking place. It's not like a great deal of time has passed. We know he's going to travel for a day, but it's not like a great deal of time has passed. How did he come off of all of these great victories and then run and hide? Let's think a little bit further. What changed in his thinking? Think about it. If God could perform all these miracles, why would there be a need to flee Jezebel? In my mind, her threat, after everything else that I had seen, would probably be pretty low on the list of things to be concerned about. God just protected me from all of Baal's servants and what they were doing. God has been taking care of me. Why all of a sudden now do I fear this one lady? How did that happen? Surely God would be able to protect him. So why flee and wish for death upon himself? How did we get here? How does he get here? What's taking place? What happened in a span of, as I mentioned, it can't have been more than about 24 hours between the time that the men are killed and he has his victory, and then he receives this letter from Jezebel. What's happened? Well, let's take a look at some of his actions and let's answer those questions, because it's something to think about. The first thing we see that he did is he cut himself off from those close to him. What do we see him do? In verse 3, he goes and he leaves his servant behind, doesn't he? Doesn't bring him with him. And then he goes off by himself. And he begins to believe this idea that I'm the only one, right? He believes that there are none like him. There are no followers of God. He is the only one. And we know, and we didn't get that far, but we know if we were to move forward into verse 18, we would find that he is not the only one, but that Scripture tells us that so there are some 7,000 who haven't turned their back on God. 7,000 versus feeling completely alone. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people. But he wasn't thinking rationally. He wasn't really thinking clearly. And what is irrational thinking? It's not endowed with reason. It's affected by loss of usual or normal mental clarity or incoherence. It's marked by a lack of accord with reason or sound judgment. It's inconsistent with reason or logic, illogical or absurd, or the idea of being incapable of reasoning. Does it make sense to run and hide because of this threat after everything that God's done for Elijah? Does it make sense for him to run and hide and to go into what I would call a woe is me attitude and start feeling like there's nothing left worth living? I want you to think about that for a minute. And I want you to kind of imagine maybe you or you know of somebody that you care about that finds out that they test positive for the COVID-19 virus. And so what they do, instead of looking to God, instead of going to their brothers and sisters and expressing the need to be prayed for and to pray with, they decide that, woe is me, I'm the only one. You know, I haven't talked to a single other Christian who's had this happen to them. It's not right. It's not fair. God, just go ahead and take my life, right? I no longer want to live. That's a real-world application looking at the nature of the situation that he was in at this time. So we really need to recognize, and I can't emphasize this enough, the importance of seeing ourselves or the possibility of ourselves slipping into some of these same things. He took his focus off God and he placed it on himself as he went and he hid. One person said, focus on God, not your problem. Listen to God and not your insecurities. Rely on God and not your own strength. And you know what? If you do those things, if he had started with focusing on the God who had just brought him through all of these various trials, he wouldn't have been worried about what Jezebel might try to do. Why? Because God had been there for him and protected him and done what he needed to. So why wouldn't God continue to do what's been needed? He gave up and made the decision that things are just too tough. Woe is me. I can't live like this any longer. It'd be better for my life to be taken. You know, from a human perspective, I can understand the idea of maybe wanting to just give up. I really can. I haven't had a chance to update you, but I will now because it fits in well with the situation with my mother and her cancer. And I want to tell you right now, she could have very easily given up. And I honestly thought that there was a time that she wasn't going to still be here. I honestly thought there was a time that I was going to have to get on a plane and I was going to have to go see a funeral. And I can understand why she would want to give up. She didn't have a lot of good news. But you know what? She had God above. She had Christians praying for her. She never lost that focus. And today she still hasn't. And she's still here. And that's still her focus. And she still has to have blood tests. She updated me. Blood tests every month to confirm, but it's blood tests to confirm that she's cancer-free. They're blood tests to let her know that she's okay. Or they're blood tests to let her know that, hey, you know, we need to be doing something. We need to work on this. And you know what? It would have been really easy for her to retreat, to not fight like she did, to get doctors that would help her, because it was a fight. To fight with insurance companies to help her. It's easy to get there, and I don't say that to praise my mother. I say that to say that things can happen in our lives, and it can be very easy to give up. The loss of a loved one. We deal with the loss of family and friends. As I get older, the one thing I learn is that as I get older, I see more death. That's just a reality that the longer you live, the more time you have to see others and see their lives end. And that can be something that discourages us, or that can be something that we seek out other Christians for comfort and support. It can be something that causes us to seek out God. And if we think rationally, if it's a loved one that has lived a life that is expected of God and is a Christian, then if our perspective is proper, we can find comfort in the fact that they're in a better place. It's hard to do, but we can avoid this irrational thinking. But here's Elijah, after just having this big battle, he's still come off this big challenge between those who worship Baal, and all of a sudden he's ready to give up. He says, it is enough, Lord. Now take my life, for I am no better than myself. How do I know that's irrational? How do I know he's really not thinking logically? If he really wanted to die, then why flee? Right? If he had had enough and he wanted to die, and Jezebel has said, woe is me if I don't have you killed, he could have just stayed where he was. He could have let his life be taken. That's not what he really wanted. But he wasn't thinking rationally. We're going to really wind it up at this point. We're not going to go into what takes place, as I said. Lord willing, if we're still here on this earth, I want to do a follow-up to this lesson at some point and talk about how God handles this. But again, I want to raise the question, why is reading this particular section of Scripture so important? And the answer is because if we're not careful, it could happen to us. If we're not careful, if we take our focus off of God, if we start thinking irrationally, if we flee from our brethren at a time when we should be running to them instead of running from them, then it can happen to us. Final verse, and then we'll have our closing song. Back to James chapter 5, verse 17. Elijah was a man subject to passions as we are, or as the New King James puts it, he was a man with a nature like ours. He was a man of God just as you and I are, and he was a man on this earth who still had some of life's difficulties. And we see what can happen if we're not careful. So I encourage you, if you're in that boat right now, if you're thinking, I'm the only one, take a look around. As I mentioned, this is the best turnout I think that we've had since COVID. Take a look around. You're not the only one. You have brothers and sisters, and you have God the Father who is waiting and listening for your concerns and seeking for you to seek his help. And if we can help you do that, make it known while we stand and while we sing.